Hello, y'all. Welcome. We see you. We see Canada. We see all the parts of the US. We see Atlanta. We see y'all.
Yeah,
Welcome.
Portland, New Mexico, Tennessee, East
Yeah.
Coast representing, West Coast representing.
Atlanta, Minneapolis. Ooh, from everywhere. It's good. Chicago. Hey, y'all have lots of people from Chicago. It's great. And North Carolina, too. I saw Saskatoon.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for coming and joining us and talking about data and perceptions of fundraising in the data. We're excited to share this information with you. Continue to share your name, your pronouns, where you're from. And we are going to also put into the chat, it might be a little bit buried just with everyone commenting on where they're from, but a very simple agenda to just kind of show you what the hour is going to look like with us.
What's up, Gavin? Jimmy, welcome. So the basic agenda is in the chat and we'll share it with you again. We're gonna do a welcome, some acknowledgements. We're gonna talk about who's in the room, and then we're gonna get into what the data says that I know that you're waiting to hear about. You're gonna love it. We are gonna have a Q&A at the end as well. So hang on because we'll be taking live questions. So I'm Michelle Shireen Miri. I am the co-chair of the Seattle chapter of Community-Centric Fundraising. I use she, her pronouns. And we invite you to state your name and where you're from in the chat as well. Feel free to write in the chat. And Anna Rebecca is going to take a couple moments to ground us.
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name's Anna Rebecca. I use she, they pronouns. And I'm just going to invite you all to take some deep breaths with me to just ground ourselves in the moment and where we are right now and where you are right now. So if you just want to join me, I want you to take a deep breath in through your nose. Take a deep, deep breath and feel your lungs expand, feel your diaphragm expand, and take an exhale through your mouth. Now I want you to take another deep inhale through your nose and just acknowledge where you are. It's a Friday. There's a lot going on. Exhale. And another time, one big breath in. Inhale and exhale. And I want to thank everyone for being here today. It's a Friday, and you chose to be here with us to talk about data and to talk about perceptions of fundraising. If you haven't already and just joined us, please introduce yourself in the chat room. Let us know where you're coming from. Participate as much as you feel comfortable. You are part of this movement, this community-centric fundraising movement. And the CCF Seattle chapter has made interpretations and identified actions based off the data we are going to share with you, but we are a limited group, so feel free to participate. So before we get into the data, we do want to do a little bit of acknowledgement, and we're going to start out with a land acknowledgement. Just recognize the Indigenous people. So if you just all would like to join me. We'd like to acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the unceded and traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, and that we occupy this stolen land. We acknowledge the Duwamish and Snohomish peoples on whose land the CCF group occupies. These people are not only the first stewards of this land in which we work, live, and build community, they are still very much here. This acknowledgement does not take the place of authentic relationships with Indigenous communities, but serves as a first step in honoring the land we are on. I'd like to take this time to invite you as well to identify the native lands on which you occupy. If you haven't done so already, please put the native or tribal land name in the chat. It's important that we take time to recognize our Indigenous communities and our neighbors. If you don't know which native or tribal land you occupy, I recommend figuring that out, taking the time to find out which communities have you displaced. In the chat, you will see a link, native-land.ca. I know there's a lot of people commenting right now. That is awesome. Pawtucket, Clackamas, Duwamish. So to find out where you are from, again, the website is native-land.ca to help find out what Indigenous land you are occupying. Additionally, if you are in the greater Seattle area, I also recommend paying rent to the Duwamish people. The link should also be available in the chat. If not, we will always provide resources at the end with a recording, and that's at realrentduwamish.org. This is a small step away from Indigenous erasure toward decolonization.
So for those of you that joined us last week, you heard one of our members, Chrissy Shimizu, give a very inspiring speech. I know she has a lot of new fans now as a result because y'all have been writing us. That's exciting. Chrissy connected many of the dots between white supremacy, racism, police brutality, and the nonprofit sector. Also talked about the unseen work of many before us and the shoulders on which we stand. At this moment, CCF Seattle would like to recognize that we're living during a transformational moment. We acknowledge that we're living in a double pandemic, mostly of our own creation. CCF promotes that Black Lives Matter and honors the lives of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, and the many others who are both known and also unknown. We acknowledge that here in Seattle, where the first Seattle chapter was created of CCF, many have died as a result of police brutality in our own town. And as Chrissy mentioned last week, nonprofits meant to serve the community are sometimes complicit in those deaths. We are in a transformational moment. And here, hyper-locally, there are great new examples of that transformation. We want to thank, again, hyper-locally, the work at Decriminalize Seattle and those who have worked tirelessly and recently won the dismantling of our youth jails through the No New Youth Jails movement and the defunding of the police here in Seattle. We're adding links to those movements just in case you're interested. You don't have to be from this area to learn about the incredible transformations that have happened so quickly here. Again, we're in a transformational moment, and transformation can happen with your participation and your engagement. Andrea Arenas, our very first CCF chair in Seattle, talked also about the pandemic last week. We want to acknowledge that these are not normal times and that the COVID pandemic is affecting Black and Brown communities at a much higher rate than other communities, that our mental health as a collective community of people is struggling, and that many of us have fallen and will fall to issues like addiction and suicide, as well as the disease itself during the coming months. Community-centric fundraising is not actually a new concept, but this articulation and the push to raise voices that are often silenced is our work. Our work at CCF was built off of the foundations that other movements created, and you can learn more about CCF's history on our website. So I'm Michelle Shireen Muri. I use she, her pronouns. I have been a professional fundraiser for the last 15 years. I currently have my own consultancy called Freedom Conspiracy, and I'm the co-chair of the Seattle chapter of Community-Centric Fundraising. I'm also launching a podcast that I'm going to be talking about later called The Ethical Rainmaker on this coming Wednesday, July 29th. And I'd love to introduce you to Anna Rebecca.
Hi, everyone. My name's Anna Rebecca. I use she, they pronouns. I am one of the CCF leaders, and my cat just jumped on my table, so this is real life. I am an evaluator with 10 years experience in the nonprofit sector, specifically coming out of museums. I'm passionate about social justice and community-centered evaluation and disrupting white dominant culture. I'm also an Aquarius, in case anyone was curious. And I can be found on LinkedIn and Twitter. And I love that my cat is relatable to folks, so thank you. We'll be sharing a lot of information in this next 45, 50 minutes. And Michelle and I will be sharing data takeaways while also creating a shared meaning-making space. We also want to say that the data we're sharing is a snapshot of a larger data set. We have so much data, and we'll share infographics in the next several months, so please stay tuned. We're also recording this webinar for folks who cannot be here today. We will be sharing the recording and resources in follow-up communications. And we are going to provide you time to reflect and think about the CCF movement and how our 10 principles, or even the data that we share today, applies to you, your life, and your work. So save the date for August 10th. That is a Monday. And come back. We will have a CCF town hall on August 10th to discuss how the movement and how the principles align in your life. So now we've acknowledged, who Michelle and I are, and we would like to see who's in the room today. So we are going to be doing a poll very quickly, and we'll be doing polls throughout the entire presentation today. But the first poll is asking about your job or your career. What is your main role? We just want to see who's in the room. And this is a multiple choice, so feel free to select as many responses. We'll give folks a minute here. And as soon as we hit, critical mass, we'll get results. All right, so I'm not surprised. Majority of people, looks like 3/4 come from development and fundraising. We also have some senior leadership today. Yes, thank you for being here. And communications, our public relations and marketing team. We also have representation in operations, research evaluation, among other roles. So let's go to poll number 2. And poll number 2 is just to see what sector, what area is your organization's mission focused. So this is a single choice. Feel free to select which best applies to the area where you or your organization works. And we'll give folks a minute. And yes, it's hard to choose just one sector. I know there's a lot of intersections. Do your best. And as soon as we get critical mass, we'll go ahead and share that data as well. All right, so it looks like we're kind of all over the place. That's great. Looks like the majority, about almost 20% come from arts, culture, and humanities. That is great. So glad to see you here. 17% from human rights, social justice areas, and education, economic development, environment, animals, healthcare. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. And yes, if we didn't include your area or sector, feel free to include it in the chat. Again, this is a participatory webinar, so feel free to contribute. All right. Thank you so much.
So, Anna Rebecca, you're a professional evaluator. Ooh, my notes went away. Hold on. You're a professional evaluator. You have your own business, Lopez Consulting, but you have a very healthy criticism of evaluation and data. And I think a lot of us, myself included, have baggage around metrics and how they've actually hurt our nonprofits or hurt our communities, also how time intensive it is for us. But over the last couple of years, I've learned a lot from you. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about why that happens before we actually get into the data.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. You get some context about me. Well, I'm a person who enjoys finding meaning in data, but more importantly, I'm a person who cares about the voices and experiences of community. I mentioned earlier that I come from a museum background. I became interested in museums when I was about 9 or 10 years old. I was pretty young, and I became interested in them because I rarely saw myself reflected in their stories and felt that I could personally change that narrative. My story, the story of a child of immigrants, the story of a queer individual, the story of an Indigenous brown girl, are rarely told. And I dedicated 10 years of my life to this sector to try and share those stories. But what I found was my voice, and I found my voice through data. It told me that I wasn't alone in my experience. It told me there were others like me, and data has the amazing capacity to highlight experiences that are rarely amplified. Evaluation, working with data, encouraged me to uplift the voices and communities whose stories are rarely heard. Evaluation itself suffers from many of the pitfalls of donor-centric fundraising. I've been a part of organizations who chased grants, courted wealthy families, bent over backwards for donors, not necessarily with a community in mind, but with the intentions of getting that dollar. Evaluation should be met with criticism as it feeds directly into the nonprofit industrial complex. Evaluation is historically extractive and has the ability to cause harm to the communities we are trying to serve. The outcomes and outputs we measure are often to the benefit of the donor and rarely include authentic relationship building with the community. And while I can't change museums and nonprofits on my own, I can empower decision-making with informed evidence, data. I can advocate for communities with data, and analyzing data, sharing the data with you today is intended to empower the community, empower nonprofit professionals who feel alone in this work, empower fundraisers who are tired because they've been doing this work for years, because it's time for change, and evaluation is part of that change.
Thank you. That's super powerful. Thank you. That's super powerful. And in all of my experiences in the sector, you're actually the first analyst and evaluator who has talked about data like that. You have your master's, and even coming out of an academic industrial complex, you still have that perspective. And I have, and I think our whole group has learned a lot from you. So thank you. And let's get to the survey. We surveyed a lot of people in a couple of different ways. Why don't you tell us a little bit about who we surveyed and how?
Absolutely. So I will say before the survey, we did have a summit. So in August 2018, CCF invited 90 fundraisers of color to discuss fundraising in the nonprofit sector. By this time, the CCF Seattle chapter had been around for about a year. We were having a lot of intimate conversations about fundraising, and we really wanted to see if others felt like this, if it was just us. Who were these people? So these 90 fundraisers of color who came to the summit shared with us their experiences, and many of them were struggling with the ways that nonprofit fundraising was being done in this sector. In May 2019, taking the information that we had from the summit, we decided to send out a big survey to understand the general perceptions of fundraising. But more specifically, we wanted to know perceptions of fundraising from fundraisers of color. And over 2,100 nonprofit professionals responded to this survey, although 14 of which are fundraisers who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color. So we're going to share some really high level, just general takeaways, general demographics of where people came from. So with top 3 areas, sectors that were represented in the survey are consistent with the top 3 sectors that were here today, or sectors and roles, I should say. The top roles included development and fundraising, senior leadership, and communications. And the top 3 areas and sectors included human services, arts, culture, humanities, and education. Now, keep in mind that this survey was sent out internationally. So while overwhelmingly the majority of people were from the US, it was all across the nation. And we did have representation internationally from the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, as well as other countries. What we found in this survey was that over 1/3 of the folks who responded came from organizations that have little racial diversity. Most people came from organizations that had less than 10 BIPOC representation. Nearly all respondents to the survey identified as white. Majority, when asked to identify their socioeconomic class, identified as middle class or upper middle class. And 1/3 of respondents also said that they were 45 years of age or older. Now, in contrast, we did want to see what were the differences between BIPOC and white fundraisers. So we did take a look at those two kind of big buckets, if you will. And what we found were that fundraisers of color are generally younger. They typically tend to be 35 years or younger. A third of the respondents, if not more, responded that way. Many of them have few years fundraising in this sector. They're typically of a lower socioeconomic class, so about a third came from working class, and slightly more people of color identified as LGBTQ+, and slightly more people of color also identified as living with a disability. Now, we will be centering data from BIPOC fundraisers today, but I also want to make clear that although we have lumped BIPOC, and I also want to say BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. So even though we're talking about them as one collective, please also keep in mind that we are a diverse group. So just be mindful of that as we continue talking about BIPOC folks.
So I know that we are going to focus today on the information that you collected from fundraisers of color. Why is that, and why wouldn't we include all fundraisers in this focus?
That's a great question, Michelle. And I would say it all starts with white dominant culture. White dominant culture is so pervasive. It's part of our society here in the US because that's what our nation was founded on. Since the majority of respondents identified as white, if I looked at the data in its entirety, we would be discussing today the perceptions of white fundraisers. We would marginalize a group that is already marginalized. Our goal with this survey was to understand the perceptions of fundraising by BIPOC fundraisers. So while we did look at the data as a whole, I did intentionally chose to center the perceptions of BIPOC fundraisers. And the data we analyzed from BIPOC fundraisers was consistent, I would say, with what the conversations were within the CCF Seattle chapter and conversations from fundraisers of color at the 2018 summit. And we will definitely be sharing that data with you here in a bit, but here's an unexpected surprise. Perceptions between white and BIPOC fundraisers are not that different. And I'm going to let that sink in for a little bit. So I want us to think about this. We are all on the same team. When we start analyzing this data, we at the CCF Seattle chapter assumed that the way people of color thought about fundraising would be very different from our white colleagues. But our assumptions are wrong. And while BIPOC fundraisers' thoughts are generally stronger and white fundraisers' thoughts are generally more moderate, we are all wanting to head in the same direction. So while everyone is on the same boat, we're all on the same page, we're on the same team, we're on it, we're headed in the right direction. We do want to be true to our intentions about amplifying and choosing to uplift the voices of fundraisers of color.
So we got a question about if we have the actual breakdown around BIPOC folks, and yes, we do. There will be more information coming about that later, and Rebecca will talk about it. And thank you for explaining that, Anna Rebecca. I think we were all surprised at CCF, and pleasantly so, because it means a lot that we're all moving in the same direction. So the perceptions between white and BIPOC fundraisers are very similar. And now we know who responded to the survey. So let's see who's in the room today.
Yeah, so we'll be putting up a poll. And this poll, we're getting into the data here. So we're going to show this first question. It's a 2-question poll. So the first one is asking about you today here in the room. How happy are you with how fundraising is done in the nonprofit sector? And once you've answered that question, go ahead and scroll down to question number 2. And this is about the fundraisers who responded to the survey in May 2019. What percentage of fundraisers do you think are unhappy with how fundraising is done in our nonprofit sector? And we'll let folks take some time to answer that. And once we have the results, okay, so if folks can see this, looks like the majority of folks are unhappy. So about 86% of people are unhappy with how fundraising is being done in this sector. 43% said they're slightly unhappy. 43% also said significantly unhappy. In addition, we looked at perception of fundraisers from those who responded in May 2019. And it looks like the majority of people said 66%. You are right. If you have seen the previous CCF launch event, you know that we mentioned this. But yes, that is accurate. The majority of nonprofit professionals, 66%, are unhappy with how fundraising is being done in the sector. And it seems like even more people are unhappy now. You know, 86% of people said that they were unhappy today. So, you know, feel free to put in the chat, how does this resonate with folks? Let us know your thoughts. And to the point, I know there are some questions in there. If we're only looking at the 14% today, no, we are looking at the full 2,100, but we are amplifying the 14%. All right, so Adrian, if you can show a slide for us, please. So while the majority of nonprofit professionals, 66% said are unhappy with fundraising in the nonprofit sector, as I mentioned, because we're amplifying BIPOC fundraisers, we also wanted to look at that subpopulation by itself. 3/4 of BIPOC fundraisers are unhappy. So when we look at the data in total, 66% said we're unhappy. But when I look at just fundraisers of color, 73% are unhappy. And this is a difficult question to kind of analyze because we didn't provide a definition around happiness or unhappiness. And we didn't provide a qualifier after this question either. We didn't ask people, hey, if you're unhappy, why? If you're happy, why? But seeing the results and seeing the results from here today, this data doesn't surprise me. Reason being is because as an evaluator, I have the amazing opportunity to be in rooms with people from all types of lived experiences and who hold roles I can only imagine. And being in a room with 90 fundraisers of color in August 2018 quickly informed me of how unhappy they were. So for many people, it looks like it's this data that I'm sharing is reaffirming what you know. That's great to see. Oh, and it looks like we can't see Adrian's screen. That's okay. We'll figure it out. We're good. So these 90 fundraisers of color, in this conversation, this summit, they talked a little bit about the struggles that they were having in the nonprofit sector. And they mentioned a variety of different things. The first being that philanthropy and the nonprofit system are built on systemic racism, and it's challenging to dismantle this system. There's concern that organizational shift toward equity and social justice will result in attrition among major donors. There's a lack of inclusion and representation across various levels of organizations. This includes volunteers, staff, board members, and yes, even donors. There's a desire to solve world problems in a grant cycle, and let's be real, that's not realistic. There's a capitalization of trauma. There's generational wealth that we're dealing with, and disempowerment with money, our own relationships with money. Power dynamics, the list goes on and on. Having these conversations with fundraisers of color really brought to light how oppressive current fundraising philosophies and practices are in the nonprofit sector. So what do we think about this? What's your reaction to this information? There's a lot of folks who are sharing with us in the chat.
Yeah, I hear Shagufta says, reaffirming what I knew. It's really difficult, especially when you have to pull from your own communities that may not have a lot now due to coronavirus. I'm seeing a lot of affirmations. Curious how we can leverage the power of numbers to move those in positions of power to make the changes we clearly want to see. But we're all unhappy about the same things, and what would change look like? That's from Hope Middleton. Selena says, I describe myself as a disgruntled fundraiser, so this really resonates. Laura Pilates says, the same practices are preached over and over again by the same white fundraising gurus. Even when they disagree, they don't challenge it. Amen.
Yeah, it looks like Marco said, I'm very unhappy because when I look up trainings and articles on fundraising to learn best practices, I am shown what not to do because the practices shown are so egregious. Ah, it's a big word.
Yeah.
So we are going to go into a second poll to kind of dig a little bit deeper in what these practices, these harmful practices that were brought up. So this next poll that we're going to be asking is going to ask what percentage of fundraisers think fundraising is harmful in the nonprofit sector. So it's not necessarily about your perceptions today, but what do you think fundraisers thought back in May 2019 that fundraising is harmful? So feel free to answer. And again, as soon as we hit critical mass, we'll go ahead and share the results.
And we see you, Danielle, with that question. How can nonprofits operate within a capitalist system while trying to subvert that system? Yes, that is why we gather, is to learn from each other about how we can do that work. I saw a lot of resonance in the chat around that.
All right, so it looks like based off of this, they said 50% of fundraisers think fundraising is harmful in the nonprofit sector. All right, well, it was more than that. 66%, 2/3 of fundraisers think current fundraising philosophies and practices are harmful to nonprofits, specifically trying to address systemic injustice. Now, additionally, over half of people of color, so it's next slide, think fundraising practices have also decreased the diversity of fundraisers in the sector. So it's another thing we saw in the data, another example of harm. And that means we are seeing less and less people of color in fundraising. We can even see this in who responded to the survey. As I mentioned, 88% of responses were white. The BIPOC fundraisers who provided demographic information to us, as I mentioned, are younger. They have less experience. They don't necessarily come from generational wealth. And additionally, we heard this from BIPOC fundraisers at the summit. We heard people say that they've never been in a room with so many fundraisers of color, and I can empathize. I'm an evaluator. I don't know what it's like to be a fundraiser, but I know what it's like to be the only person of color in the room full of white people. I know what it's like to be the only evaluator of color in a room full of evaluators. And I know what it's like to feel and think that there are less and less people who look like me in this sector, because this sector is hard for so many of us, not just BIPOC fundraisers. So when I hear this, my heart breaks. Everyone should feel like they belong, that they have the right to be at the table, that the diversity of who we are is what makes us beautiful and powerful. But the harm doesn't stop at a decrease in diversity. So next slide. 73%, so 3/4 of BIPOC fundraisers think fundraising leads to an increase in poverty tourism. So if you're not familiar with poverty tourism, it is also called slum tourism or ghetto tourism. And it's a type of tourism that involves visiting impoverished communities and exploiting people for attraction purposes without providing a monetary compensation. So even just thinking about how do nonprofits perpetuate poverty tourism. In addition, 84% of BIPOC fundraisers think fundraising leads to an increase in the savior complex, also known as white saviorism. And this refers to a white person, culture, or organization who rescues people of color from their own situation, often while taking away the ability for people of color to help themselves, grow as a community, and to even have a sense of agency.
So for years, fundraisers of color and others have been discussing the harm of fundraising philosophies and practices. And this data all seems to affirm these discussions. Is that right?
Yes, there's a perception of decreased diversity and harm being done to fundraisers as well as the community. But I would say this data also affirms that there are other nonprofit professionals who are in agreement that current fundraising is harmful and must evolve as a practice. Now, keep in mind, these are perceptions. So these aren't, these are thoughts, these are opinions, but it's also how we move as a practice. And it's not necessarily about being anti-donor. We're not saying be anti-donor, but it is about being community-centric so we can find ways to mitigate and stop harm.
So based off of all the data that you have analyzed for this purpose, what do you see as the ways that we should move forward?
Well, there's so many ways, but I think for me is based off this data, it's having a foundation. Educating ourselves in oppressive systems is one way to mitigate harm. And our survey showed this as well. When we asked nonprofit professionals how they wanted support, what are the ways that we can support them in the work that they do, trainings was one of those options. Nearly all nonprofit professionals want more trainings on race and racial experiences, disabilities and disability experiences, LGBTQ and LGBTQ experiences. And so I would say is be empowered to ask for these trainings. And if you're in a position of leadership, leverage power to get these types of resources to your volunteers, staff, board members, and yes, even donors. Now, trainings are a great first step. It's always great to be educated on the terminology, the foundation, the history, but let's be real. DEI trainings, diversity, equity, inclusion trainings are not going to win the revolution. So while trainings are important, trainings themselves are not enough. In fact, the newest Race to Lead Revisited shows that increased awareness of diversity and equity issues is not actually leading to measurable change. We provided both those links in the chat for you. And in this quote, in the Building Movement blog with the link in the chat, they discuss the Race to Lead's findings. And Karian Suarez, Executive Director of Equity in the Center, acknowledged that trainings are important and useful, but it's the transformation and the anti-racist action inside of organizations that will make progress toward equity. Edgar Villanueva, author of Decolonizing Wealth and a great friend to the CCF Seattle chapter, said that DEI initiatives, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, are often seen as add-ons, as a way to check off a box. And he reminds us that diversity, equity, inclusion, and access should be woven into the fabric of the organization. But this is going to take time, and it's going to take commitment from people of all different levels. And Margaret Mitchell, CEO and president of YWCA Greater Cleveland, said that racial equity needs to be recognized as a core leadership acumen, particularly for those who want to lead an organization in 2020 and beyond.
So if DEIA trainings are not leading to measurable change, what else is there? How do we make fundraising more community-centric, and how do we make it more anti-racist?
That's a great question. I will definitely ask people to contribute again in the chat because my ideas are very limited and I would love to see what you all say. But I also say, reference back to Carrie and Edgar and Margaret. They all alluded to this in their blog, that organizations need to engage in racial equity at various levels. So whether that's an individual level, department level, organization level, all levels have to be addressing this. And sometimes it's hard to think about. You know, I think of myself as an individual, and what is my role in all of this? And that means that I have to reflect about what I do and my influence in an organization and amongst the networks. You know, for the past 2 years, this has been my professional journey. How am I, as an evaluator of color, complicit in white supremacy culture? How am I intersecting social justice in my evaluation practice? You know, I chat with you quite a bit, Michelle. We're sisters,
Yep.
not by blood, but through sweat and tears. We talk about this all the time. How do we intersect social justice into our fundraising philosophies and practices for change?
Right, exactly. It's a long conversation that never ends. And I'm also seeing lots of the pieces of what we talk about in the comment thread as well. And we also asked this question on the survey. We asked people of color about the time that fundraisers need to spend talking about the intersections of social justice and fundraising.
Yes. So before we share that data, we're going to do another poll. I'm pretty sure this is the final poll. So thank you all. This is, again, looking at the fundraisers of color from May 2019. What percentage do you think want to spend more time talking about the intersections of social justice and fundraising? Do you think half of them want to spend more time? 95% want to spend more time? Feel free to answer and we'll show results here in a bit. 95%. Okay, so we're seeing the results here. So based off of this, you all think that 95% of BIPOC fundraisers think we should spend more time talking about the intersections of social justice and fundraising. So the data says we're not quite there, not quite 95%, but 90% of BIPOC fundraisers think that we need to spend more time talking about the intersections of social justice and fundraising. Now, that's 90% of BIPOC fundraisers. 88% of fundraisers who identified as white also said that we need to spend more time talking about these intersections. In addition, 60%, so nearly 2/3 of BIPOC fundraisers say they must play a significant role in educating donors about racism, equity, wealth disparity, and other social justice issues.
So making meaning out of this data, Anna Rebecca, what do you see?
Yeah, so when it comes to fundraising and social justice, and both of those needing to be in a conversation based off of this data, I would say that's consensus. This needs to happen. And I would say it also means that you are not alone in the way that you think in your perceptions of fundraising in the nonprofit sector, that there are other people in the organization who have the same perceptions as you. And you have an internal community. I think it's sometimes hard to talk about social justice in fundraising. It's hard to talk about social justice in nonprofits, but we have a community and we need to engage in these conversations amongst ourselves, amongst our peers, amongst senior leadership, and amongst our donors. And we have to remember that yes, there's an internal community, but folks also now have a CCF community. And we stand on the shoulders of many others, other movements, other individuals who have also been doing this work.
This data that we're sharing has been available to our group in bits and pieces for the past year. And we knew based off of the data and based off of the summit that we did, that there was a need to create a platform where we could all meet as fundraisers across the world and talk about these issues. We needed a central location to house all these conversations, which is why we created it. And we are so grateful to have Anna Rebecca as our survey analyst and finally be able to share out all of this data with y'all.
Yes, it was my joy to go through the data. It was very overwhelming. There's a lot there and there's a lot that we're still needing and wanting to share. But I would also say it was the voices of 2,100 people who responded to this survey. You know, many of us already knew these findings through our own perceptions or our own lived experiences. But I would say that the data now validates those experiences and justifies our call for change.
Yes, totally. And as a professional evaluator who has become really intimately familiar with this data, what are your professional recommendations on the steps you think we should be taking?
Yes, oh my goodness. Okay, so I have some ideas, but again, I would love for people to put in the chat what they think because you are the experts. So I would say, first off, if you are hearing us talk about white dominant culture, white supremacy, anti-racism, look to resources and education to gain a foundation.
And if you're
So
just starting this journey, look to community-centricfundraising.org to help you wrap your brain around some of these concepts if they're new to you. That's where we have content created by you and resources for you, like the 10 principles that you can amend to fit your work to wherever it is that you live and make it local and relevant to the work that you're doing. Whether you're just starting to think about these issues and just starting to realize that something is wrong with our sector, or whether you're on the other end of the spectrum ready to burn it down and end capitalism, either way, this platform exists for everyone along the spectrum. What else?
yeah, so I would say if you're already in conversations with your teams, your departments, your organizations, even your donors regarding social justice issues and fundraising, don't stop. Don't stop having those conversations. I know it can be hard. I definitely have seen people in the comments saying that white folks need to have more of those conversations with donors. And I would say yes, yes to all that. And also know, as I mentioned, you have a community here at CCF. So based on your experiences that you're having in these conversations, let us know, write to us, write to CCF, share your thoughts and experiences on a blog post. Some of our experiences can be successes, but there's also challenges and barriers. In addition, I would also say that if you feel empowered, and I know that's hard because not everyone feels empowered all the time, I get it. But if you do, and you get pushback about social justice, not belonging in a conversation about fundraising or other nonprofit topics, push back. I have definitely been a part of organizations who have told me that social justice does not have a place in the conversation. And that was devastating to hear, but we have community, we have strength in numbers. So I would say push and steer those conversations so that racial equity, justice, social justice is a part of those conversations at the beginning. And I would also say for white-led organizations, listen to your internal community. I think so often organizations listen to external communities, the audiences that they're serving, and that's great, but there's also the internal community of volunteers and staff. Listen to both white and BIPOC folks because this survey is a year old, and this is not the first time we're having conversations. CCF chapter alone has been having these conversations for 2 years. But I would also say amplify the voices of your BIPOC volunteers and staff because we know that they've lived this and they have been talking about this for much longer than we are in this moment in history. And finally, the hardest one I think to do is to really assess current fundraising philosophies and practices with a social justice lens. Do you or your organization accept fundraising best practices without critical inquiry? And I was talking to someone from the CCF chapter. I can't recall who it was because we all talk a lot so much and every day I feel like. But I was talking about best practices and they said, AR, every time I hear best practices, I hear white dominant culture. And that was kind of like an eye-opening for me. I've never really thought about it that way. And I was just like, oh my goodness, you are right. And it really helped encourage this conversation because when we think about long-term change cannot occur if philosophies and practices do not also change. And if we are not being critical of our best practices, then our long-term change will not occur. So assess your current philosophies and practices with a social justice lens. I know it's hard. A resource to help you think about practices that may align with community-centric is CCF's Aligned Actions List. So that will be available in the chat as well.
And by the way, that document is one of the top 3 things we're being emailed about. Where is it? You can find it in our media section. It's attached to one of the articles about how to implement CCF practices in your work. That's where you'll find that document. Also, the document is something that we threw together and has a lot of room for growth. So if you have more things that should be added to that list that you'd like the world to see on our website, please let us know. You can put it in the chat here, which we'll be going through. You can email us. You can write to us on Facebook or Instagram. There are a lot of ways to get a hold of us. Again, we're a volunteer group, so it's going to take us some time to respond, but we are collecting that data to enhance this very document. So let's take a look at the chat. We're looking at folks telling us about where we are headed and what we can do next.
Yeah, so we have this information, and like I said, this is the CCF chapter has had access to this data, but this data will be yours, is yours. These are your voices. So I would say, now that you have this information, and it's a little bit of information, we don't have it all yet, but what do you see as something that is possible for us? So please enter your thoughts in the chat. Now that you have this information, what do you see as possible for us? We'll give that a moment. And a second question to also consider is, how can you use this data in your personal or professional life? So go ahead and feel free to answer that as well. And if you would like to share with everybody and share your thoughts, because there's a lot in there, and like we said, we're just two people, so we would love to amplify some other voices. Raise your hand and we'll call on a couple people to share. And we'll end that way, but before we do, because I know we're almost at 1:30, thank you so much for sticking with us. Michelle's gonna do some announcements and then we'll call on some people.
That's right. So we have brand new content on a weekly basis, and this week there's an article by Elisa Schoenberger about prospect research that's a great read. Also, there's been a powerful piece written by Seattle CCF member Erica Chen about losing 2 jobs in the fight for racial justice. We're getting mail about that piece because it is so relatable and so powerful. In fact, we got a donation in the name of that piece because folks are really feeling resonance with that. So be sure to read it and check out our content regularly. And again, my new podcast, The Ethical Rainmaker, is going to launch on the 29th. It'll be available on every platform. The teaser is up now for it. My first guest is Vu, and Vu is telling us some stories that you've never heard him talk about or write about before. So you'll want to check out our first episode. You can check us out on Instagram, Facebook, and of course, it'll be a content piece created for CCF. Again, that's the Ethical Rainmaker. We're also going to create a town hall. That town hall, the first one, is going to happen on August 10th at 11:30 to 12:30 Pacific Standard Time. We are looking at other formats and what will be helpful to this community in general. So again, let us know your thoughts. You can write to us at hello@community-centric-fundraising.org. You can reach us on all of the social media platforms, including Twitter. And yeah, just let us know what you're thinking. And back to Anna Rebecca.
Yes, thank you, Michelle. So stay tuned. We have so much information to share with you in the next several months. And we'd like to call on, I think we broke our CCF website. We have
again, that's
well, there's 700 people on this webinar, so good to know. But yes, for people who would like to share their thoughts, it's at the top of the hour. Thank you so much for being here. We'll be able to stay on for another 15-20 minutes to talk to you and listen to your insights and your perceptions and where you think we can move forward with this data. So Mark, if you wouldn't mind picking some people, feel free to raise your hand in the participant section.
Great. Chantal is unmuted. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Chantal, go ahead.
Oh, thanks so much for calling on me, but I don't think I raised my hand with a question.
Oh, okay. Got it.
Appreciate saying hi to everybody, though. Thank you so much.
Hey, Chantal. All right, anybody else? What are your thoughts, questions, insights?
I have Michael Salazar.
Hi, this is Michael from Los Angeles. I just wanted to thank you for your thoughts today. There's a lot of ground to cover, so I feel like we've only touched the surface. What's next?
Ooh, that is a good question. You're absolutely right. This is the tip of the iceberg. This is very general information that we provided here today. So we are the CCF chapter is in the process of creating 5 infographics that will really dig deep into each of the takeaways that we got from the survey. So those will be coming out within the next several months. We'll roll them out eventually, so you're not overwhelmed by data so quickly. But we are also, there's content coming out of our community-centric fundraising.org. If you check out our hub, there's information coming out on a weekly basis. I think it's usually like 2 articles, 2 essays, something like that. Don't quote me. Sorry, Stacy. But there will be more information coming, so please stay tuned. And also feel free to email us at hello@community-centric fundraising.org. If there's questions that's specific to the data, feel free to ping me, Anna Rebecca, and I will try and get data to you to the best of my ability.
And I see nobody else with their hands raised.
Well, we have some questions in the Q&A. So I like this question by Grace Weil. Is donating to CCF the best way to compensate y'all for your work in educating us today? And I love that question because, you know, we're all fundraisers, okay, boo? So yes, we are an all volunteer group, and we did raise some money in order to pay Anna Rebecca to analyze the survey and create that for us, to create these virtual events for us. Also, we have a small paid team that are really supporting us in really big ways and generously donating parts of their time. But yes, ultimately, that would be great. You can absolutely compensate us financially for this work. And we'll also continue to talk to foundations who are interested in moving the dial in this way. So let us know if you got any foundation tips. We do thank Group Health Foundation and Satterberg Foundation, as well as a private donor, for funding the beginning of this work.
And Javier's got his hand up.
Yeah.
Hi, Javier, you see him. I'm in the Seattle area. And I saw a few questions come up about creating some solidarity among BIPOC fundraisers. So caucus spaces, is that an idea for you all in thinking about your work, is about creating some spaces for BIPOC fundraisers to talk more? Thanks.
Our whole CCF group, our small group that created this, all the information obviously, again, built off of other movements, built off of many conversations. The articles that Vu wrote that we talked about last week were written with him aggregating data from a lot of different folks, especially women of color in fundraising. But our CCF group is actually all BIPOC. And you can create whatever kind of group you want to in any city, wherever you're at.
And I was just going to piggyback off Michelle. Javier, to your question, if we're going to have more BIPOC, yes. We haven't planned anything yet, but very simple, yes. We'll get to it. But yes, our CCF itself, our role is to amplify BIPOC voices and our BIPOC experiences. So while we don't have anything planned for caucusing, I think that's a great group. I've personally participated in non-Black POC caucusing before and found it so incredibly powerful and moving. So I would love to bring that to the Seattle chapter and to CCF as a whole.
I see a question here in the Q&A from Ana Elisa. She asks, could you share any tools to help organizations make decisions around whom to accept funds from? I think that's a really interesting question, and it's one that I get a lot myself in my line of work. And I think we could say this, there are a lot of different ideas. We talked about it a lot when I was working with Edgar Villanueva and the Decolonizing Wealth Project. We talked a lot about what kind of money we could take and what we wouldn't feel comfortable taking. I think the questions, it leads to more questions than answers. One question that I think about is that money that was made off of whatever extractive practice, is that money still being made? Are those extractive practices still happening? Because if they are, that might be an indicator that you may not want to support that group or let them put their name on your work. An alternative to that is that some folks will say, I worked with one Indigenous organization in Canada that accepted money from one of those groups and let them know that they would not be promoting their work anywhere, the work of that corporation, or doing any marketing for them on it whatsoever. And they had to sign a contract that said, you know, yes, we realize that we're getting no credit whatsoever for this donation. So there's like the take the money, and then there's the don't take the money, you know, and just that element. But I think once we had an issue come up with an organization that was still damaging Indigenous communities and also wanted to support Edgar's work at the Decolonizing Wealth Project, and the conversation that I heard him, that he had, was that he would like to engage in a conversation with that group, though he knew that he wouldn't take that money. So using those opportunities to change the dial is also another strategy. But I think it really does depend on your organization and what your organizational cultural values are.
So I would love to answer this question on the Q&A. And it was asking, what's your #1 resource for community-centered evaluation approaches? And I'm so excited this question got asked. I was hoping it would get asked. So, oh my gosh, my #1 resource, I would say I don't have a #1, but I definitely have a top 2. So one of them is definitely Milwaukee Evaluation. While they don't so Milwaukee Evaluation is an affiliate of the American Evaluation Association. You do not have to be from Milwaukee to participate in their webinars or to have access to some of their resources. You do have to be a member to access all their resources. They have great resources out there for specifically evaluators of color, but also how to support communities of color through an evaluative lens. And I would say my second resource would be the Equitable Evaluation Initiative, EEI, which is a collaboration of different individuals and consulting groups who created the Equitable Evaluation Framework. So it really talks about how evaluation can be used for advocacy and to promote equity. And the final, if you're in the Seattle area, Seattle Evaluation Association is starting to, oh yay, thank you, Ellen, is engaging in these conversations right now. We are talking about how evaluation can be anti-racist. What are the tools and resources to be anti-racist, and also to explore the role of an evaluator in this, not just in this moment, but what the future means. You know, when we talk about defunding SPD, what does that mean for evaluators? You know, when we re-envision what a world looks like where we have social workers, mental health care facilities, where we have support, what is the role of evaluation? And I think Seattle Evaluation Association is starting to grapple with those conversations. So I highly recommend them as well.
Great, and I see Kathy's got her hand raised as well. Go ahead, Kathy.
Hey, Kathy.
Hi, so good to see you.
You too.
So yeah, I love data so much, and I love storytelling so much. And I was wondering if at some point we could have a conversation around how we can use data and storytelling to tell anti-racist stories and to uplift anti-racism through data.
Yes. I don't know what that looks like yet, Kathy, because I feel like many of us are having to come to terms with the ways we have always done our practices. But yeah, let's chat. Let's talk about how we make that possible.
Cool. I want to do it.
Cool. Okay.
It's a good idea.
Yeah, I think you could reach out to me via LinkedIn. That's probably the easiest way to get a hold of me, work related. But you can also ping me at hello@community-centricfundraising.org, and I'll respond to you that way as well.
I will do that. Cool.
I see a comment by Jeremy Tarpey. He says, we're ready to have a conversation with our board about changing our fundraising practices. Are there any articles, books, podcasts, etc., that you'd recommend we assign the board before we have this conversation as a group? That is a great question to crowdsource here. We have posted resources on the CCF website that we cherish And we're always looking for additional resources that are really valuable to other fundraisers doing this work. So please go ahead and crowdsource right here in the chat. You can write us with possibilities. We'll continue to add to our resource list. So Jeremy, answers for you on our website, but also we have such a wealth of information. Props to everyone who's been answering these questions in the Q&A. That is totally the purpose, so that we can answer each other's questions and have these discussions, engage with each other. So we're at 1:40. I think we have up to 5 more minutes.
Yeah, we have Nicole. Go ahead, Nicole.
Thanks. You know, I think I wanted to express like the importance of like the data alongside community. So like, I think what's so important about data is that it's becoming available, and that and then like the next step is like making sure people actually consume it and take it in and understand it. And there's sometimes I've encountered like situations where organizations or foundations or like collectives of foundations, they don't want somebody else's report. They want to make their own. Okay, so we encounter another delay. And what I observe is that often like moving the needle comes down to like some really hard one-to-one or one-to-two conversations. And that can often fall on the labor can often fall on the most marginalized person in the room, and that creates a lot of risk. And so arming that person with data, excellent. Ensuring that person also has a community to like prepare for those conversations, endure those conversations, and recover from those conversations is also so important. And like sometimes it doesn't go well, and there's a departure from the organization, or there's all like, you know, a million different ways it can go well. So like the data is so dang important for like moving the conversation forward, and like seeing things as clearly as we are able within the parameters of our data tools. And like also I'm so grateful to have like discovered this community as well, because it's a lot to do this work. So thank you. And I'm like so amped to learn more about this new resource, which I was totally unaware of until 2 days ago.
Woo, welcome.
Yeah, welcome. Yeah, thank you for all of that.
Great, there are no more hands.
No more
So-
hands? All right. There are plenty of questions.
Yes. So Michelle or Anna Rebecca, pick one and have a go.
Go ahead.
Oh my gosh, there's so many. Okay, I'm looking at them right now. Well, it looks like there are some questions here about fundraising.
I wanted to say that one of the issues though, Vu has been talking about this lately. He shared a story with me. I mean, we might be able to get Vu on this call actually. I know he's in the audience, but Vu was sharing that he's recently been invited to some things, you know, where foundations are inviting him in and basically asking him to continue to intellectualize these issues. So I think I've had baggage around metrics for a long time, because there are a lot of ways in which the information is sliced and diced that is really disadvantageous to communities of color. Oh, there's Vu! Hi, Vu! Vu, do you want to talk about the intellectualization of this?
Sorry, y'all. What are we talking about? I got kicked off and then became a panelist. I don't really know.
Oh, this is what happens to you, Vu. You just turn off your camera, and you're put on the panel.
Yeah.
Vu, hi, are you open to answering a question?
Sure.
All right, awesome. So wondering if you want to talk a little bit about the intellectualization of work that we do. I know that you've been called in for foundations that want you to talk to them ad nauseum about this work instead of actually doing the hard work themselves. And you've got a lot of stories in your arsenal about that.
Yeah, this is one of the biggest issues I've been having with our sector is we just love to think and we love to read white papers and put sticky dots on walls, and it's not working. So we need to stop that, right? There was one CEO who called me and said, "Vu, can you help lead a conversation about how foundations can work with communities of color?" And I'm like, no, I don't want to charge you money to lead this conversation. Okay, I would love the money, you know, but I don't want to do that. What you need to do is just take that money that you would pay me as a consultant and just give it to the Black and Indigenous communities and do that. So just like stop wasting time and stop diverting funding into data and things when we have so much data. And this, I mean, we have had this conversation at CCF that we love this data, but at the same time, this is another reason we created the survey 2 years ago. Anna, Rebecca, and Michelle and I remember, because people would not believe us when we tell people that people of color are not happy with the way, and most people are not happy with the way fundraising is being done in the sector. But they're like, well, we don't have any data for that. You know, do you have any quantitative data? It's like people of color, people from marginalized communities being consistently dismissed over and over again. And we need to stop that. So we got to figure out, let's not keep thinking. Let's just try stuff. Let's fail. Let's like make mistakes and learn from them. But let's like move on and do stuff. And yeah. And thank you for compliments on my haircut. You know, I only get one every 8 months now. I'm gonna get a mullet in like two months.
Yeah. Voob, I love what you said about, you know, I'm a data person, and so I love data, but I feel like, yes, I feel like we intellectualize data so much, and I feel like when we have data, we're always looking for the gaps in it, and we're like, oh, well, we need to do a study on this gap, and it's like, no, you know, you don't need to do a study over a study over a study. I mean, sometimes you do. But I feel like this data is here, and sure, we can use this data, this survey, you know, on an annual basis as a metric tool. But I think what you said, we need to stop intellectualizing. We need action. We need to be out there having these conversations with donors, having these conversations with our peers, being out in the community, redistributing wealth. And we can't be circling around data the entire time to just talk about it.
Absolutely. Okay, can I go back to lurking?
Yes, you can go back to lurking. Okay, bye, Vu. Thank you.
Thanks for letting us.
Bye, everyone.
Grab you out of the audience. And actually, we are joined today in our audience by all of our CCF members. But this report out is so focused on Anna Rebecca's work that we kept it minimal, but all of our members are with us. They have, some of them, like Sean, has been answering your questions in the chat, in the Q&A. And we're just about at time. Anna Rebecca, is there any way in which you'd like to end?
Oh my gosh. Well, I want to thank you all for being here. I know we've dropped a few people since then in the conversation, so I feel like I have to constantly be saying thank you, thank you, thank you. But also, we're not done, right? This is the beginning of many ways. Not the beginning of a movement, but I think it's the beginning for many of us as individuals. So I would love to continue this conversation. Data and evaluation, as I mentioned, comes with many pitfalls. It definitely falls in alignment with white dominant culture. And, you know, in the same way that we talk about community-centric fundraising, I would love to have discussions about community-centered evaluation, because it's not really a thing that exists. I mean, there's resources out there, but we need to talk about it and figure out how, at least for myself, how evaluators, how we can support fundraisers, how we can support our communities so that this movement can benefit us all. So thank you again for everyone who joining us. We have to go, like many of us are consultants, so we have other meetings at 2 p.m. But thank you again for being here and for having these conversations with us.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Have a good one.
Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.